So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Conservation and Land Management, or CCLM's webinar on intensive forest management across Canada. My name is Karina Kopp, and I will be your host for the webinar today. So I am located in Edmonton, and I would like to respectfully acknowledge that Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, and we wish to gratefully acknowledge the histories, languages, and cultures that continue to influence and enrich our vibrant communities. I am also grateful to live, learn, explore, and work in the ancestral territories of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So now, before we jump into this webinar, I do want to say a few things about the CCLM. So I did note there's a lot of people that haven't heard about the CCLM. So I do hope that everyone on the call today has had an opportunity to visit or use the website, but if not, I'll give you a quick overview of the CCLM. So the CCLM was launched back in April of 2020, and it was built with the vision to connect practitioners working across Canada's diverse landscapes to current and relevant resources. So the idea of the portal was conceptualized in 2019 when 5 collaborating organizations came together and actually identified that there was no central place or a gap to share and exchange information and learnings in conservation and land reclamation. So these founding members included Initech Alberta, EZZZ, representing the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, Natural Resources Canada, specifically the Canada Forest Service, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and the Northern American Institute of Technology, or NAIT, and specifically their Center for Boreal Research. So I do also want to thank our other supporters over the years who have kept the CCLM portal active and growing, including Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, better known as COSIA, Alberta Innovates, the Grand Prairie Regional Innovation Network, Alberta Land Use Knowledge Network, FRI Research, the Northern Caribou Canada Portal, and Fuse Consulting. So the result of this collaboration has been to create this powerful go-to site for all things related to conservation and land management. I believe in one of the past webinars, Matt actually indicated that he heard someone say this tool was becoming the Google of conservation for Canada, which is kind of actually really cool to hear. There are now over 3,000 resources within this portal, and this number continues to grow daily as we grow in our membership. It has 4 main hubs and has welcomed over 30,000 users since it was launched, which is pretty incredible. In addition, we did just recently release at the end of September the Indigenous-led Conservation Hub, and this was to bring together and spotlight Indigenous leadership and conservation. So now if you're thinking, I need to be a part of this, or I need my resources to be linked in this tool, please feel free to reach out to us after the call, and we will figure out how you can best be part of the CCLM. So we are very pleased to be hosting today's panel discussion on intensive forest management across Canada. And I do encourage folks on the call today, please contribute to the conversation by putting your questions or comments into the chat. We will go through them, and there will be a section at the end for audience questions. So to start, I would like to introduce our panel moderator for today's discussion. This will be Amanda Schoonmaker. Amanda is an NSERC Industrial Research Chair for colleges in boreal reclamation and reforestation at the NAIT Center for Boreal Research. So Amanda, I'm going to put you in the hot seat right now. Would you like to say a few words about yourself and your background?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a researcher with the NAIT Center for Boreal Research. I've been with the center since 2011. My I guess, foundational training is in forestry and forest sciences more specifically. I've done a lot of work subsequent to that in forest land reclamation, and have done some work and continue to develop work in post-harvest reforestation, and dabble a teeny tiny bit in forest management. So I think that's enough about me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amanda. I hope I said your last name correctly at that time.
Good enough.
All right. Thanks again, Amanda. So it is now my pleasure to also introduce to you our panelists for today. So first, Brad Pino is an associate professor in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. Brad, I'm going to, similar to Amanda, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. And would you like to say a few more words about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So I am associate professor here at the University of Alberta, and I work in silviculture research. So I teach silviculture classes here at the university, along with our field schools. And then the other part of the job here is the research. So a lot of the research that we're doing in my group right now is really focused on more intensive silviculture, in particular thinning and density management and things like that. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. And the other part of my background, I guess it's important here, is I am a registered professional forester here in Alberta.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brad. And I think you also gave a webinar about a month or two ago on intensive silviculture.
Yeah, that's right, through our School of Forestry here at the University of Alberta. Yeah.
All right, Trevor Jones is our next panelist. He is a research co-lead at the Petawawa Research Forest for Natural Resources Canada. Trevor, your turn. Would you like to say a few more words about yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm actually a research scientist at the Canadian Wood Fibre Centre, which is part of the Canadian Forest Service. But a lot of my research is at Petawawa Research Forest, and so, mostly right. I do a lot of silviculture work. Most of my work is in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest region, which is dominated by partial harvest, so complex forests. And I've done a lot of things over the years, lived in every part of the country and seen all sorts of different forests. And so it's nice to regroup and talk about some Alberta forests and BC forests and other forest types as well. So it'd be interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Trevor. So you've been all over the country. What has been your favorite part so far?
I did my master's at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, and I really, really loved it there. And then I spent some winters in Vancouver, and I really hated it. So it's the darkest place. So, and then I lived in Alberta, and I lived in the townhouse that was closest to the West Fraser Mill in Hinton. So I could see the trucks being lifted up, and it was lots of different
great experiences.
Yeah.
And lastly, but certainly not least, Wayne Bell, who is a forest ecology research scientist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. So Wayne, the floor is yours to say a few things about yourself and your background.
Okay. Thank you, Karina. I guess the main thing for me is I started in agriculture, wheat fields, barley, oats, etc. So intensification in forestry has a completely different meaning than what it would if I was applying the same principles to agriculture. But from there, I took a degree in forestry at Lakehead, a master's at forestry specializing in silviculture, and then a PhD in 2015 in environmental sciences at Guelph. So continue to learn. Currently, the projects I'm working on is the Nevi Plot Network, a $6.5 million study designed by myself. It's across 4 different forest types or fire regimes. So from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence that Trevor works in through into the boreal, and with the full spectrum of silviculture. So I don't work on, at least at this point in time, on individual practices. I look at integrating the practices into extensive, basic, and intensive silviculture. The other thing I'm working on right now, just before this, is a complete chronological sequence of the paradigm shifts in silviculture starting from the 1950s through to 2023. And indeed, there's even a book going to come out in 2024. So we're looking at the drivers, when the drivers occurred and how they affected silviculture globally. So that's in a nutshell what I'm working on.
Just a
And
nutshell.
I work with Brad on a few projects right now too. So yeah.
Thanks for that, Wayne.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone again for joining us today for this panel discussion. I'm now going to hand things over to Kevin to provide a brief overview of the topic we'll be discussing today.
So welcome everybody. I just have a couple of slides and we're a little behind, so I'm going to talk really fast and then hand it over to the panel. The CCLM portal is focused mostly towards a general audience of practitioners, and this includes a lot of land management planners, reclamation specialists, wildlife management folks who, unlike foresters, may not be familiar with how forest management operations may be changing, particularly out here in the West. Our goal at the CCLM is to pull together information and make it available with the hope that there will be better outcomes on the ground. With this in mind, and because it's my personal area of interest, I look forward to our panel. So intensive forest management has been a topic for a few decades now. Concerns about sustainable fiber supply and climate, including changing fire regimes, and the continued advance of regulations and expectations that forests be managed for multiple values have brought this topic once again to top of mind for many. Because of the history of development and the size of its forest, parts of the West have lagged behind other parts of the country in utilizing more intensive management. But this looks to be changing fairly quickly. In a paper titled "An Argument for Intensive Forest Management," Neil Stalker said that intensive forest management, or IFM, is an ill-defined means to an elusive goal. I just love that turn of phrase. So the goal is the concurrent management of all forest values to produce sustainably an optimum balance of quantity and quality of desired products over a minimum of time. So it typically includes a few things: advanced planning, intensive silviculture, enhanced protection, and effectiveness monitoring. So when we say advanced planning, really what we're talking about is site-specific prescriptions that's taking into account the whole forest, not just one or two parts of the forest. And intensive silviculture, we're going to talk about this in one more slide, and I know a lot of people get that confused, so I think it is also one of our first questions. But really what it is beyond sort of local baseline activities is one of the ways that people have generally defined it. Enhanced protection is usually another part of management. It considers fire, insects, and disease. Effects and effectiveness monitoring is another part of intensive forest management. So this includes longer term trends. You're monitoring for your targeted results, but also for the effects on other organisms or values in the forest, like wildlife habitat. Of particular interest to many of our users of this network, things like caribou. So what is intensive silviculture, which is often confused? If you dive into Google, you get a lot of really sort of useful definitions. One of them was the utilization of a wide variety of forest management and silviculture techniques in order to maximize the productivity of unit of forest area. But one of the more functional ways, and the ways that I like to think about it, is it's really defined by its components and locally in comparison with past practice. And maybe some of the panelists will have some other ideas on this, but are using sort of natural methods. So you're leaving a harvested site to regenerate naturally, from in-seeding, more extensive, where it's a lighter touch, fewer entries, but you're applying sort of the same treatment sort of broadly across the landscape. Basic silviculture practice, where you're doing some more things, maybe like site prep, like tending. But when you start to talk about intensive silviculture, you're usually talking about everything from harvest and different types of harvest, clear cut, shelter wood, two pass thing, through site prep, planting and fill planting, often with improved stock. So this is our improved genetics, weeding, spacing, insect and disease control. So it really is a much more than sort of that light touch, extensive or leaf or natural paradigm. So why is this important? Forest companies and others continue to advance, getting more value from every hectare of forest that they manage. This includes creating alternative value streams and utilizing biomass that was long considered waste. In its simplest form, this is often seen from here in Alberta as the use of forest residuals for energy production. But with investment in mills, new products are also being produced. So we are going to start to see some changes start to roll across. And with that, I will turn it back over to Corina and Amanda to get the panel discussion going.
Thanks, Kevin, for that great introduction. So I'm going to actually just pass it over to Amanda to begin the exciting question panel. Take it away,
Sure.
Amanda. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to throw this first question at Brad. Given that he's a teacher of students, can you give us your professor's definition that you would, I guess, teach undergraduates, how you would define intensive forest management and intensive silviculture, given the background that Kevin has provided?
Yeah, this is really an important aspect here, because I think a lot of what we do in forestry is a lot of terminology, and how we use terms is really, really important here. And this is a good one where I think the terminology gets mixed up. Oftentimes, I think we refer to intensive forest management and intensive silviculture as interchangeably, and that's not the case, right? So what Kevin just described outlines, intensive forest management, the kind of those 4 key areas: so the planning, silviculture, protection, as well as monitoring. So really, it's a lot bigger than just silviculture, I think, is the difference. But so that's what I think we have to be really clear what it is that we're talking about. Are we talking about intensive silviculture, or are we talking about intensive forest management? So I think we just have to be clear on what it is that we're saying. The next part of that is more along the lines of what is it? I think Kevin did a great job of describing that. It's kind of just getting as much as we can out of the forest in sustainable fashion. So getting as much value, as much of the different objectives, different products, different wildlife habitats, all of that sort of thing, all those values that we're getting from our forest. How can we get as much out of that as the forest as possibly in a sustainable manner? And the other part of this that's important is time, right? So that time effect is usually what we're looking at is doing things, faster as well, right? And so in terms of intensive management, maybe we're looking at shorter rotations, that sort of thing. So investments in silviculture to shorten up timber rotations, for example, could be one thing that we're getting out of it. But the biggest thing there is in all of this, it really is just really being clear about what it is that we're talking about. Is it intense forest management we're talking about, or intensive silviculture that we're talking about? Is my main takeaway from that.
Okay, thank you. Wayne or Trevor, do you have anything that you want to add on beyond Brad's definition?
I think this is an important one too. And we had a workshop in 1999, and one of the things we decided to leave out of the workshop, so we had 104 people at the table, was to define what intensive forest management and intensive silviculture was. It was really confusing, and to move forward, we just made some assumptions and move forward. What I've seen working on this topic over the years is the word intensive forest management seems to have crept into literature about 1950. Vidlac, 1967, starts to talk about partitioning the land into areas of exploitation, intensive silviculture and extensive silviculture. Then we really see the Seymour and Hunter 1992 paper sort of cements it with the triad into the parks and protected areas, intensive silviculture, and other, meaning extensive and basic. The definition of intensive silviculture has also tended to change a lot since the 60s, when we probably started to see that term coming. You got to remember, back in the 60s, there was hardly any plantations worldwide. They really started to put in the ground about 1960 and exploded. So the term was evolving through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There's a paper I wrote, Is IFM a Misnomer in Ontario? Part of that's just looking at what the terms are and seeing how they shifted so rapidly through time that now, in my opinion, I use a simple definition. Extensive, you cut, you use natural regeneration. Basic, you set the composition to a minimum number. You control the composition, you control the free to grow status, and you leave it. There's no thinning involved. Intensive, you actually need a crop plan. You start with a plan, you put it in, and you plan to commercially thin. I don't believe it's all about shortening rotations. That's something I think the geneticists all wanted us to do, is breed more trees to grow faster. But the reality is there isn't money in that, unless there's no money in growing low end products. The money is in veneers, poles, dimensional lumber. So if we're really talking about growing trees for intensive silviculture in the boreal, we really need to bring in value here. And that means in many cases thinning and extending those rotations out so we get the dimensional, the larger diameter, clear lumber that can be used for high value products. So it can be for short rotation, but I think if we're going to bring it into the boreal, we need to, or even the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, be looking at lengthening rotations. Okay, that's my spin on it.
Hey, Trevor, any dripping thoughts that need to come out on the first question? Or do you feel satisfied with these responses?
I guess sort of point of clarification is most of the forested land in Canada is managed on Crown land that has forest management plans, which are by nature intensive forest management. They do all the things that have been described. Most of them are certified forest, either FSC or some other certification system. And so by nature, forestry in Canada is intensive in forest management. And so when I think about sort of intensification of those things, you can do a whole bunch of ways to do that. And you can do it on an individual stand, or you can do it at a landscape level. And so spatial scale is also super important, along with timing, and then sort of how much per unit area or you want to get out of it. And I think the other thing to consider is that, at least in our area, so the intensity of management, either in silviculture or in forest management, really depends on your goals. And so there's a bunch of things in Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests that you don't need to do a lot of work for. We can grow sugar maple on the hood of a Cadillac, pretty much, and you don't have to plant or regenerate or any of those things to get sugar maple or beech back. But if you have problems with some things, then and some species are harder to regenerate than others, and that's when intensive silviculture comes into play. And you have to do things to create an advantage for the things that you want. And so that's how I think about it, is if you have a plan, you have a goal, and you have to have a path to get there. And some of them take more work than others. And so that can be done through harvesting, it can be done through site preparation, it can be done through a whole bunch of processes. And so, from first principles of silviculture and silvics, all the way through the operations, all the way through planning, So that's my take.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll move on to our official question one. That was our pre-question one.
Startup.
That's okay. It's important. So yeah, terminology is important. Wayne, this one's going to be directed to you first. And you actually spoke to this a little bit already. So I might focus you in a little bit on, arguably intensive forest management has evolved in Canada over the past decade and over the past several decades. Certainly, definitions have evolved. The way we do it has probably evolved to some degree. Given that it has changed and it is evolving, what do you think the key factors are that are influencing that change and the factors that are influencing that trajectory? Like, what's driving this evolution?
Yeah, so at first, in the 1950s, 60s, it was the production of fiber. There was going to be this global shortage of fiber. And in the 60s, we start to see plantations rapidly increasing, going from there. So governments are putting money into it. There's support. Then we sort of had this rapid shift where the general public had cars where they were mobile. They wanted to go out to the forest. And so we had this era of multiple use where now there's this conflict that was set up between fiber production and the public for multiple use. That continued for a while. We later then start to see other things shifting as well. By then, the Grow Brundtland's report, Our Common Future, which led to sustainable development movements, we start to see ecosystem management come in. Restoration became a common theme. So intensive silviculture was seen in many areas as a solution to restoration. We start to see other aspects of that too. New forestry came in about 1979 through Franklin and a few other individuals there. And of course, Seymour and Hunter's work in 1992. So that started to see the shift, and we started to see where the desire to maintain structural diversity and biodiversity in. Then we had the Rio Convention, and that really solidified the need to have forests that not only just parks and protected areas to protect biodiversity, but our managed forests also protect biodiversity. So intensification of silviculture is weren't immune from managing for diversity, and that has been a rift between forest production and ecologists for some time as well. Then about 1997, climate change with Kyoto came to the table. And this is where intensification really started to take off. With the RED++ program, people started to see the carbon credits and the numbers and the investment in those programs. And we start to see it in areas where fast-growing trees can be grown. We saw the federal government investing lots in terms of the research to get fast-growing plantations. So everything became fast-growing. But now we're actually seeing a change. And I'm not sure exactly what caused it, but we're now seeing what's called nature-based silviculture. And that's for the carbon part, the climate. So we're seeing a combination of the environmental, the social infrastructure, green infrastructures and things going on, restoration, and seeing silviculture blending into those. 2021, we actually saw a paper come out of Scandinavia, nature-based, and it actually talks about improved forest management. And that's a spin on intensive forest management. Is just now it means that you do intensive forest management, but you retain residual trees, you leave downed wood, you minimize disturbance to the forest floor, you manage mixed species plantations, you use your natural regeneration as much as possible, etc. So we saw this from 1950s. The monoculture idea evolve through with different paradigms through to just 2 years ago to the idea where we can still have intensive forest management with a whole bunch of add-ons that we need to consider. So in a couple minutes or less, that's where we're at. So I'm working on that paper right now. So hopefully I'll have it done by March.
Okay, so we'll have a big answer to that then. All right,
Yeah.
great. Thank you,
The
Wayne.
full answer.
The full answer, the more than 2 minute answer.
Yeah.
Trevor or Brad, do you have anything to add on about what you think has been influential in changing or evolving the trajectory of intensive forest management in Canada? Or do you feel like you're ready for a new question?
Yeah, no, I think I'll just kind of maybe follow up on what Wayne said. It just, from my perspective, it's all about what's changing objectives over time, right? So that's kind of Wayne outlined that pretty well. So what I've seen here is when there's lots of timber, this isn't a big issue, but we've seen with fires and other things like that that have happened in Alberta, all of a sudden the interest in intensive management has increased simply because there's been changes in our circumstances and we're adjusting to meet those changes.
Okay, Trevor, anything else? Any final words before we launch into question 2?
I think Wayne managed to say a lot of things, so
Okay.
Need to go any further.
Awesome. All right. Then yeah, we'll move on. So Brad, the next one is you're up first, according to my little sheet here. What role do technological advances play in optimizing intensive forest management? And what innovations do you see on the horizon for the Canadian forest industry? So if you deal with either of those, it'll be good, probably. So you
All
pick.
right.
Leave the rest to someone else.
Sounds good. Yeah, and I'm going to focus more on the silviculture part of this. But I really want to. I'm going to take commercial thinning and use that as a bit of an example to illustrate what some of this technology looks like. But for me, when I'm thinking about the technology that's changing how we do forestry, it's about understanding what our forest is, what we have out there, for example, the technology and some of the equipment that we're using, and some of the modeling. Those are kind of the 3 areas that I want to just touch briefly on here. But understanding what our forest is, there's been all this advancements in remote sensing. So knowing where our forests are on the land base or the most productive forests, things like that, being able to identify those with a high degree of accuracy is really changing how we can manage our land. Some of the things with LiDAR, for example, are coming in where not only do we know it's a productive forest, we can actually measure to get an estimate of the diameter distributions, things like that, know what the heights are in these of each individual trees, but just a better understanding of knowing what's out there. And really, I think we're moving towards sampling to really a census of our forest. So if we know we're interested in a stand, maybe we don't need to do sampling plots, like temporary sampling plots or anything like that. We can just go out there and measure almost every single tree in the stand. So that's really that level of information detail that we have about our forests is changing how we manage them. But just getting a better understanding of our forests, I think, is part 1 here. The other one with this, okay, now we've identified a stand that we want to, that's a good candidate for commercial thinning. We're going in there, we're going to be using different equipment, and the technology on this equipment is getting quite incredible, right? So we generally, at least the way that it's happening here in Alberta, generally using a harvester-forwarder combination instead of the more traditional feller buncher and skidder scenario. And there's a huge amount of technology involved in those. Like we can measure each individual tree and optimize it for getting the right number of saw logs or the maximum number of saw logs and saw volume out of each individual tree right in the middle of the harvest area. So there's just a ton of technology that's built into this equipment, and it's new equipment too. So going along with that is a lot of training for operators and things like that we'll need to be doing as we're moving forward with this. So then the other one I want to just kind of briefly mention in terms of technology is this idea of modeling is, okay, we identified the right stands, we go out and we can apply the right treatments through the actual commercial thinning. Then now what we need to be able to do is to be able to project how the forest is going to respond to these treatments. And that's another part of it is, so do we have the right models to help us make these decisions? Okay, so for example, in Alberta, the two main models, forest growth and yield models, are Gypsy and MGM. They're both good models, but they're both based on natural stands. And as we move from natural stands to managed stands, these things change. Maybe we can't apply the right treatments in our models to see how they're going to respond to these treatments. In general, managed stands just are growing differently than natural forests are for the most part. So I think this is the other part of it, is we need to update our models that we have and get a better understanding of how our forest is growing. Yeah, so I think all of those are different aspects of technology that's going to be changing how we, well, it already is changing how we're managing our forest and some of the tools that we have. And the other one that I think we're seeing is getting more of these tools into the practitioners' hands out in the field. So, everybody has their tablet with them out in the field now. What sort of, site-specific information can we get, in terms of the hydrology, the topography, the forest type, the soil type, all of this into the land manager's hand in the field, so they can make the right description or the right prescriptions in the right places, is going to be a really big part of this moving forward.
Great, thank you. Trevor or Wayne, anything else you want to add about technological advances beyond? Brad covered pretty good gamut there.
Sure. Just want to sort of share sort of an anecdote. We recently did a harvest in Petawawa, so sort of north part of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest. And although sort of the technology of harvesting has changed sort of back and forth in our region quite a bit, from hand felling to feller bunchers to forwarders and skidders and all sorts of different things. In the most recent harvest we did, it was, probably less than 200 hectares. And everything went to a sorting and merchandising yard. And that went out to 20 different mills in the region. So, and the optimization of that is just phenomenal. So they're producing everything from hog fuel to veneer logs to fence posts and hydro poles. And so just an amazing diversity, and sort of the change in focus of industry from sort of mill-centric to getting, the best material to the best mill to the best use, I think is something that's been changing sort of through the years as well. And when you have a diverse product stream from these sort of multi-species forests that we're growing, you're going to have to continue to do that more and more and more, or else you can't, make your harvest pay. Particularly in some areas. Some areas it's easier, close to the mill, whatever. But yeah, I think that's sort of, when you start saying diversity of forests, then you have to have diversity of product streams. That's super important, or else there's no hope for you at all. So
great, thank you for that anecdote, Trevor. Wayne, any last thoughts before we get the next question?
I think the biggest change that I've heard in the last 2 weeks was the use of drones for inventory, and having the main drone and satellite drones, up to 4 satellite drones, being used to gather continuous inventory, so that a unit doesn't have to wait for the province once every, whatever it is, 10 years to do an inventory. They can do an inventory immediately after a fire or a big harvest year or some event that happened, budworm. So it can be as required. That will enable, once we start doing those multiple times, we can start to grow the entire forest. Back to, I think, what Brad was alluding to. This information now, we're not using growth and yield plots to make little projections and monotypic yield curves for, single species like jack pine. We can actually grow the entire forest through time. You can see which areas are gaining volume, which areas are losing volume at almost at any point in time that one wants to fly those. So I think that's going to be a major one. The other one is integrating forest models into a model system. So I'm working on the integrated forest modeling system where we bring in process-based models that can handle polycultures and different multi-age trees within a stand, to bring those together and do yield projections and do forest succession, linking those to Landis, linking those to the forest science apps, and then into the fire models like Burn P3, Fire Smart, B folds, etc. So now we start to integrate our models into, so we can do some better landscape level managing. And I think if we're actually going to be looking at silviculture, like we do all our economics at a stand level, and so Fossman's economic model is 1848. So I think there should be some new thinking of economics since that point in time, is to start to look at silviculture at the landscape level. So the investments in intensive silviculture in a landscape, it's not independent of roads or those sort of distance from the mills, etc. It's an integrated part of the process of growing and delivering wood to the mill. And I think once we get to that point, I think we'll see the value of silviculture increase rapidly. Yeah. Anyways, just
Okay.
crystal balling that one.
We'll come back to you in 10 or 15 years and we'll see if that's true or not. We'll have the exact
Maybe.
same webinar, maybe. And we'll have the video to back it up. So
I said
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you everyone for those responses. So Trevor, this one is for you first. This is a big question. So I'm going to break it out. So in Eastern North America, partial harvest silviculture systems are commonly utilized. Related to that, do you believe it's possible to intensify forest management in a partial harvest system? And then within that, yes or no, are there barriers that are affecting implementation of a more intensive system in partial harvests?
So yes.
Okay.
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. Perfect. Easy.
We're done here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a role of it for sure. I think sort of there has been interest in sort of bioeconomy and using more material from forest and sort of for bioproducts, whether it be hog fuel for mills or pellets or what have you. I think there's interest there in doing that. I think we've done some work in different harvesting systems, shelterwood and selection, and sort of trying to get more material out of it. So the unmerchantable, undersized, things like that. And it's totally possible to do it. And sort of the work that we've done in terms of time of motion and tracking machines and things like that. The trade-off of bringing that stuff to the landing versus the effort to get it there seems to be pretty reasonable. I think where we fall down a little bit in sort of that whole sort of using some of the small undersized tops and branches, things like that, is that we don't have markets for it. The bioeconomy sort of pellet industry and things like that, especially in Central Ontario, is still very much just a dream. There's no place to send the material. The pulp market is down, and so the degree at which you can do intensive sort of silviculture and intensification of harvest is really tied to sort of mill owners and long-term wood supply and their sort of willingness to take on risk associated with that type of harvesting and that supply, and whether or not they think they can invest $100 million in a mill to do this. And when you're talking about small material, you can't you can't truck it very far before you have to deliver it with a check. And so that's also a problem. And so even if you have good road networks, really sort of the value of the material and the distance it has to travel to get to the mill is really critical for that to succeed. And so I think the barriers really are sort of presence of mills and pushing up the bioeconomy in general. And the fact that Canada is so darn big and there's fewer and fewer mills taking material. I think that diversification of product streams helps. Being able to do good merchandising on a concentration yard in our sense is very helpful. And so that'll help the bottom end of your harvest. And so if you have those things together, then you can probably make a go of it, but still having places to put that material is a limiting factor.
Great. So we need solar powered transportation.
Teleportation would be good.
Autonomous solar powered.
Autonomous solar powered transportation. And we could start really expanding these.
Yeah,
markets.
I think it's like that 100-kilometer range is kind of magic.
Yeah.
You go too much further than that. And with the price of fuel and everything else right now, it's a challenge. So.
Okay. All right. Yeah, fair enough. Brad or Wayne, any thoughts? Not that you're in the East, Brad. I don't know, but maybe you have an opinion you'd like to share on partial harvest systems. But Trevor, I think you nailed it pretty good there. Any other thoughts?
I'm with Trevor on this one. It's yes, and yes. You can and you probably should. Back in 1995, when we started to get more into ecosystem management and linking our silviculture and forest management to natural disturbances and trying to emulate them, we start to realize that not every fire is complete. So to take 1,000-hectare area and completely clear cut it without using partial cutting or even irregular cutting. So there's, to go for some areas clear cut, seed tree, shelterwood, etc., depending on the silvics of the forest, would be important. Now, I would add a caveat to what Trevor said, and you also need to consider the fire, insect disease, and severe weather aspects of that. So when you consider those in addition to what Trevor said, I would say yes. Okay.
Great. Okay. Last thoughts.
Don't forget
to you,
the
Brad.
fire, insect disease, and severe weather.
No one in Alberta is going to forget fires for a while. I can tell you that, at least for Western Canada, certainly.
Fires for Western Canada.
Yeah,
budworm for Eastern Canada.
Exactly. Yeah, we're not forgetting.
I'm explicitly talking about budworm.
I guess, yeah, that's less
balsam
less
fir,
problem.
partial cutting and balsam fir. Yeah.
Well, when I'm thinking about partial harvest systems, oftentimes we're thinking in terms of kind of a little bit lighter touch forestry, but as Trevor's saying, it doesn't necessarily need to be the case. But in our context here in Alberta, that's generally what we're thinking about in many of these. If we're going to be implementing that, not the thinning per se, but other things, shelterwood systems, perhaps selection systems in the future. That's not really something that we do here right now. But when I think about this, it's really okay if we agree that we want some of these sorts of partial harvesting systems on the ground. Okay, that all seems good. What's the trade-off then between that and intensive management? I think this leads us into the next part of the discussion here, kind of going down that idea of zoning. What portion of our land we want in more intensive management for timber production? Where do we want to manage for other resources and other things like that? So that's how I'm kind of thinking about this idea of the balance between more intensive silviculture and more extensive or ecological silviculture in other parts of the landscape. And I think that's really the discussion that I'm starting to have a lot more. It's not, are these things possible? I think we're all in agreement that yes, of course we can be doing these things. Now it's where should we be doing them? How much do we want of this on our landscape? And those are really all related to our management objectives that we have, not just for individual stands, but for our whole forests. And so these are much, much bigger conversations that we need to start having to answer these questions.
Okay.
I'd add one more point to this, and it's based on a conversation I had with another individual yesterday. And that is with the partial harvesting system. As we open that up, it's some individuals may see this as an opportunity to begin back to the high grading. So you do diameter limit cuts, and you do some things that really aren't silvicultural, but are put forward as if they're a silvicultural prescription. So we need to be careful of when does partial harvesting become slide back into high grading. That's a slippery slope. But anyways, maybe another conversation on another day.
That's a big can you just opened, Wayne.
I figure for you, Trevor, that's
Like,
down
like
the
we
Great
just-
Lakes, St. Lawrence.
we'll just hold comment for that. For,
How
you
many
know,
examples can you
oh my
provide?
god. So yeah, let's talk a regular shelterwood for the next month. So yeah.
Can of worms. Okay, we'll leave that one.
Okay. I think with the current time we're at, we'll definitely do one more question round ask, and then potentially get into some of the audience's commentary, unless the folks tell us differently. I just observed a communication in the chat here, and I think one person can do this, is just define for the audience what CT is versus PCT.
CT versus PCT?
Yeah.
Oh, PCT is pre-commercial thinning. So you're just like in a jack pine stand, when we get to be 15 to 20 years old, say there were 6,000 stems per hectare there, we would pre-commercially thin them and drop it down to 3,000 or less. There's no commercial harvest of those trees that are dropped. With a commercial thin, the idea is you're actually going to harvest those trees and bring them out. So it's got the commercial product of some type, maybe poles or biomass or some use.
Perfect.
But PCD is generally young, and it's just putting them on the ground.
Yeah, I think it just came up in the discussion earlier, and they wanted some professional definitions. So, all right, well, we'll tackle one more question here. And because I live in the boreal, we're going to ask a question about the boreal forest. As the moderator, I think I get to be choosy. And this one goes to Brad first. And of course, everyone weighs in. So, are there specific challenges or opportunities related to intensive forest management in Canada's boreal forests compared to other ecological zones? And then how are those challenges being addressed? So is the boreal a special and rare flower that is very different from intensive management in the rest of Canada? Or and then how do we address that?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think the important part here is all of our forests are special and all for different reasons, right? So it's not, but in general, a lot of these techniques, a lot of these ideas, honestly, they work everywhere. So all the same principles apply regardless of if you're growing lodgepole pine in Alberta or loblolly pine in Mississippi. The same principles apply here. How can we grow trees faster, things like that. So all that stuff would be the same. How they get applied might be a little bit different, but the underlying principles are going to be the same. So what are the limiting factors are going to be different, for example, things like that. But a lot of the same treatments, they all do apply. So in general, it's how do we apply these general or standard treatments, things like that? How do we apply them to our specific scenarios and to our specific sites? And that's really the local part. And so it has to do with the site characteristics, the soil types, the slope, aspect, the climate, the species, the silvics that we're dealing with, all of that, the competition that we're dealing with, all of that is what really makes it unique. And so I don't think there's anything about the boreal forest that really makes it any different, at least from particularly from a timber management perspective. One of the things that I've found is there seems to be a misconception that trees grow slowly in the boreal forest. And in general, I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, or at least in my part of the boreal forest here in northern Alberta. So for my example of intensive management, we did a study with the Weyerhaeuser folks, kind of looking at what would be the implications of doing more intensive silviculture on a certain portion of the landscape across their forest management area. And in general, what we were able to show is that we could get on the better quality sites, so the ones with good soils and things like that, and we're able to produce similar stand structures at about age 50 through intensive management, being pre-commercial thinning and commercial thinning, compared to at age 80 if we wouldn't have done that sort of thing. So there's lots of these things that we can, this idea of 100-year rotations in the boreal forest, we don't need that. It doesn't have to be that. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but it doesn't have to be that. We were out at a field tour a couple of weeks ago, looking at a 24-year-old white spruce plantation that was being commercially thinned by Vanderwell. It was spectacular to see. So this idea of trees don't have to grow slowly here. This is one of the misconceptions that I think people have about the boreal, is that all trees have to grow really, really slowly here. Well, they don't. That's the biggest thing I think we have to kind of get over in terms of the boreal forest is perceptions more than anything else.
Great. Okay. Well said. Trevor or Wayne, any thoughts on that? The same everywhere or rare flower?
I think there's a lot of perceptions about the boreal. Brad has hit the number one, the slow growing, which affects our economic models, which affects industry's willingness to invest. The reality is, I believe, like what Brad's saying, what J.D. Irving's doing, what I'm seeing in my own Navy plot network is we have tremendous potential to grow trees with competition control. So if we control the composition and function and structure of these plantations, and where necessary, have the use of herbicides, and we do tree improvement on top of that, I think we can definitely grow trees almost to the same yields that I think Scandinavia can. They have less competitive species. I've walked their plantations. They don't have calamagrostis, red raspberry, fireweed, trembling aspen, et cetera, to deal with over there. So they're a little in a better position to intensify. So the other thing is then you put the perception of the public. And the public plays a big role here too, in that they see intensification ultimately leading to monocultures. Period. Single species industrial monocultures. And what we have seen now since 2001, that we can deliberately grow polycultures. We can maintain structure. We can maintain, diversity, whatever you want. Set your objectives. It's people need to be clear what the objectives are, and the foresters can do that. So that perception needs to be busted. There's another perception then over on the industry side where the policies aren't in place for telling the industry they must do this. So when foresters get to the boardrooms and they're in front of CEOs and board members trying to justify a silvicultural program, and a CEO asks them, is this legally mandatory? And of course, to be honest, they have to say no. Then the question one must ask, why would a CEO want to invest thousands of dollars in planting trees versus giving those thousands of dollars to his shareholders? I mean, this is something that needs to be reconciled as well. So there's a number of these big myths about managing for intensive silviculture on crown lands that I think over the next 15 to 20 years we need to work on. But anyways, I think they're solvable, but we need to work on it.
Great, thank you. Okay, Trevor, you get the final word.
That's a bit dangerous for
I
a
know.
Great Lakes St. Lawrence guy who has that policy of never ever turning north off the Trans-Canada. I don't have a lot of experience with the boreal, but I think it is valuable and a really important thing to protect. And I think as we're talking about things like invasive species and things like that that are coming up and like just dominating southern Ontario forests and southern forests, some of those things reach the boreal, we're in trouble. And so I think there's a place for intensive silviculture, intensive forest management in stopping some of those invasive species. I mean, if I was at a meeting with Canadian, our Toronto Conservation Authority, and they use glyphosate like it's going out of style, and people are okay with it because it's killing dog strangling vine and all sorts of terrible things that are destroying forests. And they're like, that's okay. So they're also living across the street from cornfields that are getting sprayed 10 times a year. So, I mean, it is what it is.
It's sprayed once a year.
It's like, so yeah, I think, a lot of the things that we can do now, to protect those forests, are very important because, they are valuable as they are. And I think, they are unique in that they haven't been touched by a lot of these invasive species quite as much as a lot of the other forest conditions. And so being cognizant of that is the fact that they are relatively, pristine compared to a lot of other forests in North America and around the world. And I think that's some of the value that they have, and that it's worth fighting for and fighting to maintain. So across the landscape in general.
Great. Yeah, those are all excellent points. Thank you. Karina, do we have time for another question, or should we go into audience questions?
You know what? I think we have time for the last question.
Okay.
And then we can ask the audience if there's questions. Thanks, Amanda.
Sure. Okay, the second last question that's now the last question. Okay, so Wayne, this one is back to you. So we've been talking a lot about the all the benefits and the things we want to do in intensive forest management and the things we like about it. But can you talk a little bit about some of the environmental impacts or perceived environmental impacts of intensive forest management practices across different regions of Canada? They may be different. Maybe you speak to the region you know best. And then how do we integrate some of those concerns into a sustainable forest practice while still meeting those intensive objectives?
Okay, I think to answer that, we have to break intensive silviculture into different ideologies, temporal ideologies. So if we looked at the 60s plantations, like largely we were putting those plantations into afforested areas, largely areas that have been cleared for whatever reason, farmlands that failed. So those plantations serve one purpose, and that was fiber production and stabilizing the sands that they were growing on. So we see across Ontario large areas of mono species red pine plantations. They're all coming up. They're worth millions of dollars as hydropoles and other products. They're fairly low in biodiversity, compositional, functional, or structural diversity. So that's one error, and the public sees those quite often, and that sets the tone for the next era, right? So then we start to see the desire to maintain biodiversity, both the compositional, structural, and the functional. So those plantations started to leave, 25 residual trees or whatever the number that was set is, we start to see variable retention. We start to see other things going on in those plantations. Now, from an environmental point of view, a lot has been met, right? Then along comes 1997 with the Kyoto process and the red. So now carbon becomes a big trade commodity. And so now your shifts, so now sequestering and storing carbon become important. So now it's not just about short rotations, because you can store a lot of carbon for longer periods of time if you can continue that plantation going through thinnings, right? So each era of time, you start to see changes in what the environmental impacts were. So I think when we answer this question, it's very important to talk about the era and the purpose of those plantations, and then associate that with the environmental impacts that come in. I mean, stabilizing sands at the time, even though it's a monoculture today, was a highly valuable environmental outcome, right? So stable sands was the environmental goal. The byproduct was productivity in monocultures, but stabilizing those below sands was the big one back in the 60s and earlier. So all through time, now we're seeing the shift into more. The next shift is the polycultures and the multi-age plantations. So I think over the next 10 to 15 years, that aspect of plantations is going to start to enter into the new desire. So, I mean, if we looked at J.D. Irving's work, I think almost 15 years ago when I was out in New Brunswick, they were already into polycultures. And so the only additional part would be to the multi-age. And in the NEB plot network, we're going out to our Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests and planting shade-tolerant trees now, 20 years post-harvest, to start to create multi-age, multi-species, intensively managed plantations. So it is possible, but you have to set your targets, what your objectives are, which environmental, I mean, you can shift. The other thing that we did in NEB is you don't need 100% of your land base in an area. So there's this idea, I think we saw it in Stalker's part, where the whole forest is managed. No, the whole forest is never managed intensively. We need to realize there's buffer strips around streams, lakes, visual areas, etc. So there's always this leave areas. Those areas are always going to be there. They're up to 30 to 50% of some forests. So that part of the environment is already covered as well. So when you start to look at environmental impacts, you need to consider, is it just at the stand level you're discussing, or is it the landscape level environmental impacts that you're discussing? Because at the landscape level, if you can grow, as Brad said earlier, and Trevor said as well, the 100-kilometer haul limits, if you can reduce your road network down, that's a massive environmental impact as well, right? So you need to consider time and space when you consider environmental impacts.
Great. Thank you.
That's my thoughts on that one.
We did ask. So
You did ask.
Trevor or Brad, did you have anything to add on to that? Sorry.
Yeah,
I
I had a couple of thoughts here. One of the things I think is we need to start looking where we can get multiple wins out of whatever we're doing in the forest, right? So the example that I've been thinking a lot about is thinning, right? So thinning, we're talking about it mostly from timber production perspective, but also thinning can also that's essentially what we're doing now in many of our forests for fire hazard reduction treatment. So fire smarting around
Yes.
communities. That's thinning. We're calling them different things, but they're essentially the same thing. So how can we get together amongst people who are doing these sorts of activities, and how can we start quantifying the benefits to timber, but also the benefits to community protection? That's huge. There's also lots of similar sort of conversation related to drought resiliency. So thin stands tend to be more resilient after a drought. So fewer trees die in thin stands after drought compared to unthin stands. So things like that. So when we're thinking about the future climate, what can we do that can perhaps help us with timber benefits, but also meeting some of these other landscape scale objectives? And thinning, I think, is one that's a really good example. Can be done to meet climate smart forestry objectives, fire protection objectives, and timber objectives. So where are these easy win-win-win scenarios that we can start focusing on and start doing those now? That's the place to start for me, that can maximize the benefits that we're getting from a single treatments.
Good. If only we had an NSERC grant to look at drought resilience. We do. I'm full of silly little commentary. Okay, Trevor, you get to take her home again. Final thoughts, environmental impacts, options, opportunities.
I think going back to the size of the forest in Canada is a really important thing to drive home here, is that, we can't functionally get to all of our forests to manage it in our lifetimes. It's impossible. If we wanted to manage for sort of an invasive species, or for any of these things that are going to be affecting our forests or chasing insects, it would take lifetimes to get to all of those stands. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to really focus on areas that we want to do good forestry, and we want to have productive forests, and that are sort of key areas for fiber production. And this is an old sort of concept in sort of intensive forest management areas. But I think as the economics roll out, and sort of our realization that we can't do everything everywhere, I think it's really important that we do take the time to realize that we do need to focus an intensification of silviculture into sort of areas that are close to mills, and that are sort of productive lands, and that are good for sort of society, and good for multi-use forests. So while they're growing, they could be mountain bike trails or hiking trails, or all these other things that serve all of these sort of processes. And by doing that, you keep people out of our virgin forests, who are sort of, if you've ever gone through Algonquin Park or places like that, it's tourists that are driving sort of all of the bad things up into the forests and some invasive species, and it's not forestry that is done there. And so it's really, I think, beneficial to us to have this in intensive forest areas, and really focus on combining activities there, sort of social and economic values of these forests, and making sure that they're being used as effectively as you can, and protecting what we can and the rest of it. So that's not to say we leave it alone and let it sort of burn and do all the things that certainly less intensive work, sort of further away from mills and things like that. So
great. Okay. Karina, thank you everyone for contributing. Where are we at? Other questions? Do we do time permitting questions? What would you like of
Yes,
this
thanks,
rowdy
Amanda.
bunch?
Super engaging conversation. Wow, very interesting. I definitely learned a few new things today. So I think we're going to quickly see if there are any audience questions. I do want to mention that a survey for the webinar was put into the chat, where you can submit requests for future topics and to be contacted for more information. about the CCLM. So I do want to invite any of the attendees here to use the raised hand function to ask any verbal questions they may have as well. I think we'll quickly check to see if we have any audience questions for the panelists. And forgive me if I do not see the raised hand. If I do not see a raised hand, please just feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in.
I see one question in the chat. Do you want me?
Oh, yes, go for it. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay. I know who this is from. All right. If intensive forest management is different from intensive silviculture, is there any difference between intensive forest management, integrated forest management? Intensive and integrated versus integrated forest management, I think is what's being asked. Define.
Yes, I think integrated forest management came after multiple use. So we start to see it more probably in about the 70s. Don't have the exact date. But yes, it is defined where you actually integrate. And for Ontario, that was mostly with the moose management and plantations being integrated. So you're starting to look at multiple uses being planned for at the same time in an integrated plan, right? So before it was multiple use and you had different areas for different purposes. This is now you're integrating them and having multiple uses of the same areas. So yeah, it's about 1970s integrated forest management starts to appear in the literature. I could check my other computer. I can give you exact date.
That's all right. I think we're good. So
You're
it's
good.
kind of along the lines of what Trevor was mentioning in his last comment, integrating commercial thinning practices into other values or, public use for walking their dog or bike riding or this kind of thing. Would that be a reasonable potential integration? Yeah.
Yeah, more when it was introduced, it was more for wildlife management. So you had the hunter and fisherman group and recreational group and your fiber production groups, and you were integrating the planning on the landscape. Now this is being done before the GIS systems really came out. The GIS was about 1986. So after 1986, once you start to have GIS technologies available, then we start to really see the term sort of just became common practice to do that. But before that, foresters actually had to deliberately think in terms of integrated forest management.
Great. Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh into or follow up from Wayne's comment or response? Good. Okay. We'll need 2 minutes at the end. Oh,
perfect.
You want your 2 minutes now?
I think that wraps things up really nicely. So I just wanted to, given that we're essentially 2 minutes to the half hour right now, and I want to be very cognizant of the 1:30 cutoff. I'm just going to quickly say thank you. So I want to thank our speakers for this fantastic and super engaging discussion. I also want to thank Amanda for moderating the panel. Just a reminder to folks on the webinar right now, please don't forget to fill out the survey, which was shared in the chat. Also, please stay tuned for more knowledge exchange seminars that the CCLM will be bringing to you. Another reminder, if you are a current member or want more information on how you can get involved with the CCLM, there will be a member meeting on December 5th, which you can request more information for in the survey. So be sure to check out the CCLM portal, which is where you can stay up to date on upcoming events and where you can find the resources you need to do the work that you all do. So again, thank you so much to our panelists and Amanda, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Again.